They called my car junk, a worthless heap sitting under a gray tarp in my driveway, the kind of thing neighbors whisper about, rolling their eyes as if I didn't belong. So one morning, without even asking, the HOA tried to tow it away. Smug, smiles, crossed arms. They thought they'd finally gotten rid of me and my so-called trash. But here's what they didn't know. Under that tarp was a legend worth over $2 million. And even that wasn't the biggest twist. Because, while they laughed, I was holding the deed to their entire block. It started on a Tuesday morning at exactly 6 a.m. The sound of a diesel engine growled down my quiet street like an unwelcome intruder. I wasn't even home. I was still on my way back from a business trip, but my neighbors were wide awake, watching like it was primetime TV. Curtains cracked open, coffee cups in hand, faces lit with anticipation. The HOA had decided today was the day to get rid of what they called that junk car sitting in my driveway. The vehicle in question wasn't just any car. It was covered, tucked neatly beneath a plain gray tarp. To them, it looked like a forgotten project, maybe a broken-down relic abandoned after a midlife crisis. The tarp had gathered some dust, sure, but in their eyes it was an eyesore. Something that didn't match their carefully curated image of perfection. Manicured lawns, German SUVs gleaming in every driveway, and houses that looked like they were copy-pasted from a luxury brochure. At the center of it all was Diane Blackwell, the president of our HOA. Arms crossed, designer workout clothes that had never seen a drop of sweat, her smile tighter than a drawn bowstring. She stood proudly at the edge of my driveway, directing the tow truck driver like a queen ordering her knight to slay a dragon. Except in this case, the dragon was my covered car, my inheritance, my secret. The tow truck driver looked less convinced. He tugged at his gloves, glanced at the paperwork Diane had shoved into his hand, and then looked back at the car. Abandoned vehicle, the paper read. That alone told me everything I needed to know about how Diane worked. She didn't ask, she didn't check, she assumed. And in neighborhoods like this, assumptions are often louder than facts. By the time I pulled into the subdivision, my rental car crunching across the perfect gravel drive, the scene looked like something out of a courtroom drama. Neighbors huddled on sidewalks, whispering as the tow truck backed toward my driveway. The smell of diesel fumes mixed with the artificial sweetness of freshly laid mulch, and I could almost taste the arrogance in the air. I stepped out, suitcase in one hand, and every head turned as though the villain had just walked onto the stage. "Morning," I said, my voice calm though my blood was simmering. "What exactly is going on here?" Diane's smile widened, but not kindly. "Community standards, Marcus. We can't allow abandoned junk to lower property values. Your car has been reported. We're taking care of it for you. For me." The way she said it dripped with fake generosity, like she was doing me a favor. The tow driver shifted uncomfortably, clearly not enjoying being caught in the middle. I walked across the driveway, the sound of my shoes crunching against the gravel louder than it had any right to be. I reached the car and placed my hand gently on the tarp. My neighbors leaned closer, hungry for drama. Some even had their phones out recording. I could feel their eyes piercing me, their judgment heavier than the humid Virginia air. "This isn't junk," I said firmly. Diane tilted her head, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "If it's not junk, why is it hidden under a tarp? We value transparency here in Willowbrook Estates. Covered vehicles are unsightly. They send the wrong message." And there it was, not about rules, not about property values, about appearances, about control, about fitting into their neat polished box where individuality had no place. My car was a symbol, and they wanted it gone. I looked around. Faces in every direction. Some amused, some annoyed, but all convinced they were right. All convinced I didn't belong, that I was dragging down their neighborhood with my trash. The tow driver cleared his throat. "Sir, I've got orders to remove this vehicle. Unless you've got paperwork to prove otherwise, I'll have to take it." His tone wasn't hostile, just businesslike, but it lit a fire in me. Paperwork? Oh, I had paperwork, more than he could imagine. But not yet. Timing is everything in stories like these. I took a slow breath. You tow this car and you'll regret it. The words hung heavy in the air. The crowd rippled, whispers darting between neighbors. To them, I sounded defensive, maybe even desperate. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that beneath that tarp was no rusting heap. It was a Ferrari, a 1967 Ferrari 275 GTB. Faded? Yes. Weathered? Yes. But worth more than every single SUV parked on this street combined. But I didn't say that. Not yet. Let them think I was crazy. Let them think I was clinging to trash. Because when the truth finally came out, their smugness would collapse under its own weight. Diane raised her clipboard like a gavel. You've been warned, Marcus. This community has standards. You can either follow them, or you'll find life here very difficult. And that was the seed. The seed of arrogance watered by her need for power, and fertilized by her disdain for anyone who didn't play her game. She thought she was protecting her neighborhood. What she didn't realize was that she had just picked a fight with the wrong man, and this fight was going to cost her everything. I stood still, the tarp still covering the Ferrari, the tow truck engine idling behind me. Around me, my neighbor's eyes burned with curiosity and judgment. Diane's smirk told me she thought she had already won, but she had no idea. None of them did, because that so-called junk wasn't just my car. It was my inheritance, my shield, my sword. And soon, it would be the key to showing this entire block who really owned Willowbrook Estates. When you see me standing in that driveway staring down an HOA president and a tow truck driver, it's easy to assume I've always had the upper hand. But the truth? 6 months before that morning, I was at rock bottom. My name is Marcus. I'm 48 years old, and not long ago, my entire life felt like it was falling apart in slow motion. 20 years of marriage ended in a brutal divorce that stripped me of almost everything I thought mattered. The McMansion? Gone. My retirement account? Split down the middle. Custody of my 2 teenagers? My ex-wife won that battle. They stayed, with her, and when they did come to see me, it was like visiting a distant relative they barely remembered. Cold hellos. Quick goodbyes. My house never felt like their home. I wasn't just losing things. I was losing people, identity, and purpose. I'd built a life around a marriage that no longer existed, and when the paperwork was signed, I was left standing alone, staring at empty rooms. Have you ever been in a place so quiet it hurts? That was my life. I needed a restart. Something smaller. Not another sprawling house that screamed failure every time I walked into it, but a place where I could breathe. Where I could rebuild. That's how I ended up in Willowbrook Estates, a neighborhood where the grass looked painted and the sidewalks smelled like fertilizer and money. Homes ranged from $800,000 to over $2 million. Too perfect, too polished, too fake. But I didn't choose Willowbrook for the manicured lawns or the prestige. I chose it for one thing, the 3-car garage. Because you see, I had inherited something that needed protection. That inheritance came from my Uncle Raymond, a man who was equal parts brilliant, eccentric, and impossible to understand. Raymond wasn't the kind of uncle who showed up to Thanksgiving dinners with gifts. He was the one who disappeared for months, then reappeared with stories that sounded too wild to believe. Oil deals in the Middle East, investments in companies no one had ever heard of. He was sharp, private, and always 2 steps ahead of everyone else. As a kid, I idolized him. He'd let me sit in his study while he smoked cigars, teaching me lessons I didn't understand at the time. One thing he said stuck with me more than anything. Marcus, real value hides in plain sight. Most people only see what they expect to see. That's their weakness, don't ever make it yours. At the time, I thought he was just being cryptic, but after his death, those words took on a meaning that would change everything. Uncle Raymond left me his pride and joy, a 1967 Ferrari 275 GTB. At first glance, it looked terrible. The paint was faded, the leather cracked, the chrome dulled, To anyone else, it looked like an overpriced lawn ornament better suited for a junkyard than a garage. That's exactly what my neighbors saw when I covered it with a tarp. Junk, a relic, proof that I didn't belong in their perfect world. But they were wrong. Dead wrong. Because underneath that weathered surface was a numbers-matching, museum-quality classic, one of the most coveted Ferraris ever built. Every nut, every bolt, every piece of paperwork was intact. And the maintenance records? They went back 30 years, organized in a way only Uncle Raymond could manage. Still, the car wasn't just about money. It was a symbol, a test, a message, from Raymond beyond the grave. He hadn't given me a polished trophy. He'd given me something that looked worthless to the untrained eye but carried hidden value beyond imagination. It was his way of teaching me one last lesson. Don't measure worth by appearances. I didn't realize how much that lesson would matter until I parked that Ferrari in Willowbrook. At first, I kept it covered for simple reasons. Dust, rain, sun, damage. I was researching restoration shops, considering my options. But in this neighborhood, perception is everything. A gray tarp in a sea of polished SUVs was enough to brand me as an outsider, and outsiders don't last long in Willowbrook Estates. Within 3 days of moving in, Diane Blackwell, the HOA president, was at my door with her practiced smile. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said, her perfume stronger than her sincerity. Then came the real message. "Just wondering about that vehicle situation in your driveway." I told her it was a classic car, temporarily covered. Her smile didn't move, but her eyes narrowed. "We have standards here," she said, handing me a notice printed on cheap paper. It wasn't legal. It wasn't official. But it was threatening. The kind of note designed to test whether I'd fold under pressure. That night I sat at my kitchen table with the notice in one hand and my uncle's words echoing in my head. Real value hides in plain sight. Diane thought she saw a piece of junk. The neighbors thought they saw a man clinging to trash. They were all blind, and I decided then and there I wasn't going to roll over. But here's the thing about battles like this. They never start with fists. They start with whispers. Within a week, I felt the freeze out. Conversations stopped when I approached. Neighbors turned their backs at the mailbox. Kids who waved the first day now avoided eye contact. In their eyes, I was the guy who didn't follow the rules, the outsider, the problem. The car wasn't the issue. It was the excuse, the tool Diane used to assert her control. But what she didn't know was that the car she called junk wasn't just worth millions. It was the key to unlocking something even bigger. Because Uncle Raymond hadn't just left me a Ferrari, he had left me a web of secrets hidden in plain sight. Secrets buried in files I hadn't even opened yet. Secrets that would flip Diane's little empire upside down. But at that moment, I didn't know all that. All I knew was that my uncle's so-called junk car was becoming the spark of a war. And as I stood there staring at Diane's warning notice, I made a promise to myself. I would fight. Not just for the car, not just for me, but for the lesson Uncle Raymond had drilled into me my whole life. Because sometimes the things people dismiss as worthless are the very things that change everything. And soon my neighbors and Diane were about to learn that the hard way. The knock came on the third evening after I'd moved in. Sharp, measured, not the friendly kind of knock you hear from a neighbor bringing over cookies. This was the sound of someone who wanted you to know they were in control. I opened the door, and there she was, Diane Blackwell, HOA president, 52 years old, perfectly pressed yoga pants, a smile stretched so wide it looked painful, and a clipboard tucked under her arm like it was a weapon. If you've ever met someone who radiates authority without ever having earned it, you know exactly the type. "Marcus?" she asked, though I could tell she already knew. "Welcome to Willowbrook Estates. We're so glad to have you here." Her perfume hit me before her words did, something strong and floral masking the sour note of superiority beneath it. She extended a manicured hand, her nails painted a deep crimson, the kind of red that said power. I shook it, firm, but brief. "I just wanted to stop by personally," she continued, her tone dripping with politeness. "Get to know our new resident. Make sure you've had a chance to review our community standards." There it was, the real reason she was standing on my porch, not to welcome me, not to introduce herself, but to remind me that in Willowbrook, the HOA wasn't just a committee, it was the law. Her eyes flicked past me, scanning my entryway like she was appraising the furniture. Then, almost casually, she nodded toward the driveway. I couldn't help but notice you've got a vehicle. Out there, covered. I held her gaze. Yes, a classic car. Temporary cover. Her smile tightened like a rope pulling taut. Well, you see, in Willowbrook, we pride ourselves on appearances. A covered vehicle can send the wrong message. You understand, don't you? The way she said it wasn't a question. It was a test, a warning disguised as concern. And behind her polite tone, I could hear the unspoken words, comply, or we'll make your life miserable. She reached into her clipboard and slid a single sheet of paper toward me. Not official letterhead, not even properly formatted, just a cheap printout that read, violation notice, vehicle storage. It felt like sandpaper in my hand. Of course, she added quickly, this is just a courtesy, nothing to worry about if it's handled quickly. We all want to maintain the beauty of Willowbrook. I scanned the notice, pretending to consider it, but what I was really doing was studying her, the way her jaw twitched when I didn't immediately nod, the faint impatience in her eyes when I didn't rush to apologize. She was used to compliance, used to people folding under the pressure of her smile. Appreciate the heads up, I said finally, my tone even. I'll look into it. Her smile didn't move, but her eyes hardened. Good. We like neighbors who respect the rules. It makes life easier for everyone. With that, she turned on her heel, her sneakers hitting the porch with sharp finality. As she walked back down my driveway, I noticed Craig, her husband, leaning against their BMW, arms crossed, beer in hand. He gave me a nod that was less neighborly and more warning. That was my first real introduction to HOA culture in Willowbrook. On the surface, smiles, polite greetings, neighbors waving as they walked their designer dogs. But underneath, a rigid hierarchy enforced by Diane and her loyal board members. A hierarchy built on fear, compliance, and the constant threat of violations. Over the next week, I felt the shift. Conversations at mailboxes died the moment I approached. Neighbors who waved on day one now looked past me like I was invisible. A text chain started buzzing, the kind where your number wasn't included but you knew you were the topic. The whispers weren't about my furniture or my moving truck. They were about the tarp, about the junk car sitting in my driveway. In their eyes, it was proof that I didn't belong, proof that I wasn't one of them. One afternoon, as I collected my mail, I overheard two women walking past. One leaned to the other and whispered, not quietly enough, if Diane doesn't handle it, property values will tank. Can't have trash cars sitting around. Trash. Cars, that's what they called it. It wasn't about the car. It was about control. About Diane establishing dominance over the new guy before I had a chance to find my footing. The HOA wasn't designed for community. It was designed for conformity. And Diane ruled conformity with an iron fist wrapped in a designer glove. I started reading every page of the HOA covenants that night, highlighting, annotating, memorizing. And what I found was interesting. There was no specific ban on covered vehicles for less than 30 days. No rule I'd actually violated. Diane wasn't enforcing the law. She was testing me. And that told me something important. Diane's power wasn't real. It was perception, illusion. Like a magician distracting the crowd with one hand while the trick happened with the other. She thrived on fear and assumption. Most people didn't question her because questioning meant conflict. But conflict, that's something I wasn't afraid of anymore. Every time I thought about folding, about pulling that tarp off just to blend in, I heard my uncle's voice. Real value hides in plain sight. Most people only see what they expect to see. Diane saw junk. The neighbors saw an outsider. But what they couldn't see was the truth. And when the truth came out, It wouldn't just challenge Diane's authority, it would shatter it. That first encounter on my porch was meant to intimidate me, to put me in my place, but instead it lit a fire. Because the more Diane pushed, the more determined I became to stand my ground. And trust me, this was only the beginning. The first official violation notice appeared in my mailbox on a Thursday morning. Heavy cream envelope, Willowbrook Estates letterhead across the top, and Diane's signature at the bottom in bold blue ink. Improper vehicle storage, immediate action required. The words jumped off the page like a scarlet letter. According to Diane, my covered Ferrari was a detriment to neighborhood aesthetics, creating an unsightly view that lowered property values and contributed to community dissatisfaction. Community dissatisfaction. Translation: Diane doesn't like it. It wasn't the last. Over the next 2 weeks, I received 3 more notices. One accused me of neglecting landscaping, even though I'd hired the same lawn service as everyone else. Another complained about improper waste bin placement, claiming my trash can was visible for 12 extra minutes after collection. My favorite: noise complaint. Garage door operation outside acceptable hours. Apparently, opening my garage at 6:45 a.m. was an attack on the peace of Willowbrook. Every notice came with a subtle threat: fines, hearings, possible legal action. To the average homeowner, it was exhausting. Annoying enough to force compliance, but vague enough to keep you second-guessing yourself. That's how Diane operated. Death by paper cuts. At the same time, the neighborhood itself began to turn colder. People who smiled at me on move-in day now crossed the street when I walked by. Conversations hushed when I approached the mailbox. Even the kids who once waved as they rode bikes past my driveway now avoided eye contact, glancing nervously at their parents before pedaling away. The freeze-out had begun. If you've never lived through one, it feels like being erased in real time, like the world keeps moving around you, but you've been cut out of the picture. Barbecues I wasn't invited to, block parties that somehow skipped over my address, cars slowing down to glance at my driveway, then speeding away with smug certainty. And the worst part? It worked. I'd come home at night and feel the silence pressing against me. No friendly waves, no borrowed cups of sugar, just a house that felt more like a bunker than a home. But I wasn't built to fold. I sat at my kitchen counter one night, violation notices spread out like a losing poker hand. The smell of Diane's perfume still clung to the paper from her, visits sharp and artificial. I flipped open my binder, the one filled with highlighted HOA covenants, every clause cross-referenced and tabbed, and there it was. Section 4.27. Covered vehicles permitted for up to 30 days without board approval. Section 6.1.3. All violations required written notification before fines could be assessed. Diane hadn't followed procedure. She hadn't followed anything except her own script of intimidation, and that meant her power was paper thin. The next morning I drafted my response, short, professional, ruthlessly precise. Dear Mrs. Blackwell, I have reviewed the violation notices regarding my vehicle. Please refer to Willowbrook Estates Covenant, Section 427, which explicitly allows covered vehicles for up to 30 days. Additionally, Section 6.1.3 requires written notification prior to any violation proceedings. As such, your notices are without merit. Please consider this my formal request for all future correspondence to comply with HOA bylaws. I printed it on crisp letterhead, signed it, and dropped it in the HOA's box myself. The sound of the envelope sliding into the slot was small, but to me it was thunder, and I didn't stop there. I made copies, sent one to the HOA's actual attorney, whose information I still had from my purchase documents, sent another to the county clerk's office, just in case. Documentation is armor in wars like these, and I was suiting up. When Diane received my response, I knew instantly. Because the next time I saw her at the mailbox, her smile had cracked, just slightly, enough for me to see the frustration simmering beneath. She handed me another notice anyway, but her eyes betrayed her. She wasn't used to being challenged. The neighborhood freeze-out intensified. That weekend, I found 3 piles of dog waste deliberately placed on my lawn. An anonymous note arrived in my mailbox. Trashy car for trashy people. My security cameras caught shadows moving near my driveway at night. Teenagers sent to do dirty work, no doubt encouraged by whispered rumors. Still, I documented everything. Dates, times, photos, video. If Diane wanted war, I would fight it. On her battlefield. The battlefield of evidence, rules, and exposure. The isolation was real. Nights were quiet. Too quiet. I'd sit in my garage staring at the tarp covering my Ferrari, wondering how long I could keep this up. Wondering if it was worth it. But then I'd run my hand across the tarp, feel the outline of the curves beneath, and hear my uncle's voice again. Real value hides in plain sight. Most people only see what they expect to see. The neighbors expected to see a broken man with a broken car. Diane expected me to fold like every other resident she'd steamrolled. But I wasn't them. So the next time Diane called an emergency HOA board meeting at her house, conveniently giving me only 48 hours notice, I came prepared. Not just with my binder of covenants, but with something she didn't expect: calm, confidence, and the willingness to push back. The night of the meeting, her kitchen had been transformed into a kangaroo court. 4 board members lined up behind the island, Diane presiding like a queen. A lone chair waited for me, deliberately placed in the center of the room. I sat down, folder in hand. Diane slid her evidence across the counter: screenshots from doorbell, cameras, emails from concerned neighbors, even a property study she'd clearly Googled minutes before. Property values are at risk, she declared, her voice sharp. Children are asking questions. This community cannot tolerate unsightly vehicles. I listened, patient, silent. Then, when she finished her dramatic speech, I reached into my folder. The sound of paper sliding across granite echoed in the kitchen. Every eye followed as I laid out my highlighted covenants. Section 427, I said, my voice steady. Covered vehicles allowed up to 30 days without board approval. Section 6.13, written notification required prior to fines. Show me the specific violation, Diane. The room went quiet. One board member shifted in her chair. Another cleared his throat. Diane blinked. Once, twice, her smile faltering. Maybe we should table this pending legal review, one of them suggested nervously. Diane's face flushed crimson. She forced a smile, but her grip on her clipboard tightened. Fine. Tabled. For now. I gathered my papers, stood, and left. My footsteps echoed down her pristine hallway. It wasn't a total victory. Not yet. But it was the first crack in Diane's armor. The first sign that her intimidation tactics weren't bulletproof. And as I walked back to my house, the night air thick with the smell of mulch and resentment, I realized something. Diane thought she was dealing with just another neighbor. Just another pawn in her little game of power. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this was only round 1, and I had plenty more moves to play.